Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Samuel Mwara. I'm a lecturer here in the business school. I also volunteer, I hasten to add, as a trustee with the David Hume Institute. As a lecturer, I've delivered many long lectures in this very room. It is my pleasure today to give a very short welcome. It's not going to be very lectury at all. To everybody here, thank you so much for coming to the business school. We love, as an ivory tower, old-fashioned university, to have people visiting us from industry and from the community out there. And it's lovely for me as a trustee to be able to host people here today. We don't have any fire alarms or anything. Well, we don't expect to have any fire alarms or any tests of the alarm system. So if the fire alarm goes, that means there is a fire hazard, and you just follow the usual fire exit signs. And I have seen some of the corridors here. You do that shouting fire to help save a life. And if you do need the toilet or anything like that, you'll see the signs outside, or you can ask me or any of my David Hume Institute colleagues. Again, just to thank everybody for coming today. I've come in myself from Glasgow. I don't usually get here this early. I've often been told, people from Glasgow come to Edinburgh for the culture. I've come in today for enlightenment, and I very much look forward to the talk today and everybody's participation. And with that very short welcome, I will now welcome my director, Susan Murray, to do the formal welcome to the event itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samuel. Welcome everybody, and welcome everybody online as well. I'm Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, and I'm really pleased to have you here today to discuss what is the 20th wave of the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. That 20 waves, it means we've been doing it for 5 years, and the data really, the longer we do it, shows trends over time. So we're really pleased to be talking about that today. The tracker is something the David Hume Institute does with the Diffley Partnership, and we couldn't do it without them. So Scott will be presenting that data. I'd like to thank the University of Edinburgh Business School and Samuel for hosting us here today, and to Asda for sponsoring the refreshments afterwards. We're very grateful. It's those friends and support that mean that we can bring you events free of charge and open access. So just to remind everyone, turn off mobile phones so that people online aren't hearing the little buzz of you getting messages. The only thing that's left for me to do is to introduce the speakers. We're short on time, so there will be a whistle-stop tour of loads of insights from across Scotland and consumer insights. Scott is a familiar face to our regulars. He's the Senior Research Manager of the Diffley Partnership. He will present the results, and then we'll move on to our panel. Sam Miley is the Head of Forecasting and Thought Leadership at the Centre for Economics and Business Research, who will be presenting on behalf of Asda's Income Tracker. He's just recently moved to Spain, so we might get some differences of what Spain is like compared with the UK at the moment, possibly. I'm maybe pushing too far. And then we'll move to Lesley Gray, who's the Strategic Insights Director for Scotland for Worldpanel by Numerator. They work with brands and retailers on a unique 360-degree understanding of consumer behaviour around the world. So you may remember Lesley Ann from last year, where she shared insights on the baskets of Scottish consumers, and we're delighted to welcome her back again for the 3rd year in a row, I think. Not everyone gets these insights, so you're very lucky. Scott will speak for around 15 minutes, and then we'll move on to the other two. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm Scott Edgar from the Diffley Partnership, and I'm going to run through the findings from the latest wave of the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. So as Susan mentioned, it's the 20th wave that we've been running the study, but the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker is a quarterly survey of people in Scotland, 2,000 people in Scotland per quarter, and it captures basically, what's important to people, whether people think things in Scotland are kind of head in the right direction or wrong direction, and also their economic outlook, so whether they personally feel that they're better off or how they personally feel about the economy. So we always open with a very broad question about whether people in Scotland feel that things are going in the right direction or the wrong direction. And for quite a long time now, the majority of people in Scotland have, generally speaking, felt that things were going in the wrong direction. So in this latest wave, that's at 55%. It's up 1 percentage point from the last wave, and the proportion that think things in Scotland are going in the right direction stands at around a quarter. And that's actually down 5 percentage points from the previous wave. But we have had a 4 percentage point increase in people saying they simply don't know. So I think one of the kind of context that we're in at the moment is, you know, we've very recently had the Scottish Parliament election, so we're kind of adapting to a new Scottish Parliament, and lest we forget, we've also got a new Prime Minister as well in the form of Andy Burnham, and we're seeing some early signs in the issues that are important to people in terms of him having an impact on setting the agenda in Scotland across some of the measures. We asked people what they think are the top 3 issues facing Scotland today. And for the second wave in a row now, cost of living and inflation is the issue that's most %. Tell us the cost of living and inflation is amongst the most important issues facing Scotland today. In the last wave, it replaced healthcare in the NHS, which had been top for, you know, years, basically, at that point in time, and that's now sits in at around 40%, and a 7 percentage point decrease in the proportion selecting that this wave. What we've seen here is a bit of a broadening across the issues, so we've seen certain issues kind of spike a little bit up over this wave that we have maybe not seen for a while. So this chart cuts off if it's basically under 10%, so there's loads more issues, so you've got to get above 10% to be on this particular chart. But ones that have kind of come on in this wave that wouldn't have been here. So if you were here 3 months ago, you wouldn't have seen social care or the environment and climate change on this chart. Both of those have experienced an increase in terms of respondents saying that they're important to them. I think we can put the social care one down to the fact that the Prime Minister very early on set out his stall, and that's very important to his premiership. And then secondly, the environment and climate change, and I will show this in a second. We tend to see some seasonality here. And it's perhaps that we could conclude that given wildfires across the UK and other climate events, we see that going up by 7 percentage points this wave. The other one on here is immigration. That's gone up 5 percentage points from the last wave. That's now and this is a record high for the series. We've never had it as high as 25% of people putting it among their top 3 issues. And indeed, if we look at immigration as an issue over the course of the whole series, what we see is that actually at the kind of beginning of the series in October 21, it was a very much minority of people that would put it in the top 3 issues, and over time we've seen it gradually increase in terms of its importance amongst people in Scotland to this record that we see on this series. But it has been for about a year now that we've seen it around that between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4, and of people picking that amongst the top 3 issues. And similarly, with social care, it's been kind of, you know, around 10% the whole time, and the little bump that we've seen in this wave, you know, doesn't take it massively out of step with what we've seen across the series, but it does certainly show that people are taking signals, I think, from the UK government. It'll be interesting to see how well that carries on as, you know, Andy Burnham's time in office progresses. If he chooses to pick issues, will he be having more of an impact on the debate north of the border than we've actually seen before, given that social care is actually not within the remit of Andy Burnham to do really anything about up here. It's interesting that it's followed through. And then with environment and climate change, I mentioned that had gone up by 7 percentage points this wave. In the wave prior, only 6% of people put it amongst their top 3 issues, which was the lowest that we'd seen. And I mentioned that we see some degree of seasonality in terms of the environment and climate change. So when we first started this series, October 21, that was around the time of COP26. So that 1 in 5 selecting it, it was an issue that was being discussed a lot. People were talking about environment and climate change. There was a big set piece event happening in Glasgow. And then kind of interest perhaps tailed off a little bit. You know, there was a change, you know, both UK and Scottish governments kind of abandoning their climate commitments to net zero, pushing them down the line, and the public responded to that. It just wasn't being spoken about as much there. In 2023, we saw that then rise to 18%, and that summer there were quite, you know, a lot of, wildfires across Europe, and that felt like a really new thing at the time, I think. I think people hadn't really seen that and hadn't really experienced that, so we've seen that get up to around that 1 in 5. What's interesting is that over the time since then, it's sort of, plateaued around a 1 in 10 people thinking environment and climate change is amongst the top issues. And even when we see that rebound now with stuff happening here in the UK that's linked to that. It's not quite at that magnitude of the 1 in 5 that we've seen before. It's still, you know, around 13%, and there's lots of issues hovering around that sort of proportion, like housing, trust and politics. So I think what I'm saying is it's going to be a quite interesting time to see what sort of issues kind of bubble away and take prominence over the course of this Parliament. And this slide I simply put up just to show some variation in terms of demographics across this, because of course there is. So if we take, you know, the youngest people in the sample, those aged 16 to 34, we see a slightly different, you know, variation of, you know, important issues. But what I think kind of really stands out when we look at this is the cost of living and inflation, healthcare and the NHS are pretty consistent across different demographic groups. And so is immigration. Actually, it's actually quite high on the, you know, list of priorities across, and there's not huge demographic variation in there overall in terms of placing it amongst the top issues. There is, however, with environment and climate change, younger people, degree educated people are more likely to put environment and climate change amongst their top 3 issues. And we also ask people just think locally as well, just to see if there's any kind of big variation between national and local. And you can see here, it falls out in a pretty much similar order when we ask people to think of their local area. Cost of living and inflation, the most important issue to people, generally speaking, followed by healthcare and NHS, and followed by immigration and then housing. And there is some variation between, you know, kind of local and national. Like, so for example, housing seen as more of a local issue than a national issue. Amongst people place more prominence on it. You know, whereas kind of healthcare and NHS and cost of living just are quite high across space, and things like transport and illegal drugs, people sort of localise to themselves. And it's a little bit different across the country, but nevertheless there's still some real consistency in there. So this is by the Scottish Parliament regions, and the consistency that we see here, again, is that cost of living and inflation, healthcare and the NHS are those top 2 issues amongst people. Immigration prominent across the piece, but differing sort of, you know, we see housing higher up in the Edinburgh and Lothian East region and Glasgow regions and Highland and Islands, and all for different reasons there. If we think about the kind of local housing pressures that are on, there's different reasons why those are important in those places to people there, but nevertheless we see that variation. You know, and crime and criminal justice actually higher in Edinburgh and Lothian East. And environment and climate change seems a really important issue in Edinburgh and Lothian East, and part of me wonders whether the fact that our field work was on while Arthur Seat was on fire might have had a little bit to do with that in this area, but, you know, in terms of thinking of it as a local issue, but there we go. And we also ask people about their economic priorities, so what are the kind of most important, and you know, it feels very repetitive at this point. I keep saying cost of living and inflation's up very high, but it is again, and it's been the biggest sort of economic issue that we've seen over the course of this series, 6 and 10, saying that, you know, it's amongst the most important economic issues. A lack of spending on public services seen a little bounce, and that's a kind of one that's been going up a little bit, kind of wave by wave over the last few data points. So it'll be interesting to keep an eye on whether that starts to break out, maybe away from some of the others. But also a lack of infrastructure investment and social security benefits are the ones where we've seen sort of bigger, some kind of reasonably big changes here in terms of more people selecting them. But the cost of living nevertheless remains a top economic priority. And the last wave that we did this, you know, we see there's like, I always find this is the hardest one to talk about, because I always go, people are less pessimistic than they were before when we talk about this, but nevertheless we see here that still big majorities of people think that the economy is worse than it was 12 months ago. So 68% tell us they believe that the general economy is worse than it was 12 months ago, and 67% tells they think it's going to be worse again in 12 months' time. So there's still a deep, you know, overall degree of pessimism about the economy and economic conditions, and that's bounced a bit since the last wave. It was 3/4 of people on both metrics last time that thought it was going to be worse, but it's really stabilised back to where it was two waves ago, which I'll show in a second. And similarly, what we really see here is that there's increases in proportions who think things are about the same. So are people in Scotland sort of, you know, stuck in a funk, stuck in a holding pattern, waiting for something to happen that will have an impact on their, you know, on their economic fortunes? It does feel a little bit like that over the course of the series. And, you know, these are nets where we just take away, you know, the better and worse from each other. And we can see here that and I have to say this every single time, that this axis is all in the negative, and it has been over the course of the whole series, but we're nowhere near the sort of, you know, kind of nadir that we were in August 22, when we had like minus 90% economic, like, you know, people thinking that it was worse or had been worse. We're now up at, you know, kind of nets of like, as we were saying, kind of like, you know, 6 and 10. So there's been some bounce in the last wave, but it really takes us back to where we were sort of 2 waves ago when we began to think, oh, maybe we're going to move on. But we've not seen that follow through, that kind of rise in optimism over the course. And we kind of see mixed, mixed views in terms of people's, satisfaction. So, people in general, when they think about their employment, they feel generally satisfied with their job security. 2/3 tell us they're happy with their job security. Nearly 3/4 tell us, that they think their employment provides with enough paid hours. But when people think about the money in their pocket and what they've got to spend, we see kind of split levels of satisfaction here. So about 2 in 5 tell us they're satisfied with their income level. 1/3 tell us that they're satisfied with their income covering the cost of living, but half tell us they're dissatisfied with that. Similarly, around, kind of 46% telling us that they're satisfied with their ability to meet household bills. I'm not going to probably surprise anybody in the room by saying this dissatisfaction's higher amongst people in SIMD 1 and 2 than it is amongst SIMD 4 and 5, and that dissatisfaction is also higher, amongst people with children as well compared to households without children. And what's the sort of impact of all of this? So over the course of the series, we've been asking people, in the last 12 months, what have you done as a result, of concerns about money matters? And half people tell us that they've been reducing non-essential spending and reducing, spending on leisure activities. And now, kind of higher portion telling us that they've saved less than usual. And 2 in 5 saying that they're dipping into their savings to meet higher costs. So what's interesting here is we see a lot of behaviours that basically, and I think I've kind of maybe laying the way for some of our panellists to come up in terms of like what what impact that has on what people then go on to spend. You mix that with the sort of lack of economic confidence. There's often a paradox here of this idea that people have money in their bank accounts, but they're not confident enough to go and spend it. And then we see these, we also see these kind of spend behaviour things. But also, many are telling us that they're losing sleep and their mental health has been impacted as well by their concerns over money matters. And there is some variation in that too. So, what we tend to see as households with children are taking more of these, measures overall compared to households without children. So, cutting back on leisure activities, a higher proportion cut back on leisure activities with households with children and are more likely to report strained relationships at home and losing sleep. And impacts, when we think about food, which we're going to come on to as well, we see that in SIMD 1 and 5, the proportion that tells that if skipped meals are cut between SIMD 1, and SIMD 5, so the most deprived postcodes to the least deprived postcodes, are telling us that they've, skipped meals or cut portion sizes or bought less fresh produce. So we're seeing a kind of cumulative series of impacts here on people's health in terms of immediacy, impact on mental health and losing sleep, and some potentially kind of longer term things that come from lack of engagement with, leisure, lack of engagement with, kind of just having a bit of fun with your children and doing things, and also people making decisions about their diet as a result of concerns about money matters. And finally, we also asked people just basically, we've asked this 4 times now, about, the kind of impact it's had on their food choices. So we see an increase in this way from the last in the proportion of people 6 in 10 who tells that they've reduced the number of takeaways or times they dine out. Around half tells that they shop for food based on price rather than health. And then also other decisions that people make are reducing the quantity and quality of fruit and vegetables in their diet, consuming more packaged and processed foods, choosing to eat less meat to save money, around 1/4 for each of those, and around 1 in 5 saying they're choosing food that requires no or very little cooking to save money. Again, these are higher amongst households with children and higher amongst those who live in the sort of most deprived postcodes across basically each of these measures. I think that's me pretty much bang on my 15 minutes. So thank you very much, everybody, and I'll hand over to Sam. Just use the mouse to go.
Thank you. So it's a bit of a life goal to be in front of an Edinburgh audience during the festival. But I unfortunately gave up on my arts career a long time ago, so consumer economics is the theme of the day. A lot of what Scott has already presented chimes quite well with research that me and my colleagues at the Centre for Economics and Business Research conduct on a regular basis. And key amongst those is our collaboration with Asda, which is our long-standing income tracker publication. The Asda income tracker is essentially a measure of household spending power. It's a measure of discretionary income, which is the amount that households have left to spend on luxuries, save, or to invest once they have accounted for their tax contributions and covered a basket of essential goods and services. So the cost of living crisis has obviously made this tracker go on quite a wild ride over the years. But zooming in on the very near term and to Scotland specifically, we see some quite interesting observations. Most notable of which is that on an annual basis, if you look at growth in the income tracker metric, Scotland's latest reading showed an increase of just 1%. That is important for two reasons. First of all, it's below the rate of inflation, meaning that in real terms, Scottish households are actually going backwards relative to where they were a year ago. And second of all, it's the slowest growth of any region or nation in the entirety of the UK at the moment. And I think there are a couple of reasons that we can unpack for why Scotland is rock bottom of the pile at the moment. The first is on the income side of the equation. So households' income is predominantly made up at the aggregate level by labour market exposure, so wages and salaries. But of course, to receive wages and salaries, one needs to be in a job. And that is something where Scotland has been performing weaker than the UK average recently. We are seeing a loosening labour market at the aggregate level, but Scotland specifically has seen the largest increase in its unemployment rate over the last year. It's gone from having a below UK average unemployment rate this time a year ago, increasing to above 5%, which is well above the UK average now. And with less labour market exposure, fewer people being in paid work relative to a year ago, that's putting downward pressure on the rate of gross income growth at the national level. The other side of the equation that's particularly important for explaining Scotland's relatively laggard performance is on the spending side. So, as mentioned, the income tracker covers the costs of a basket of essential goods and services, and Scotland has seen the cost of its basket increase at a faster rate than the UK as a whole over the last year. There are a couple of drivers of that. First, there are some policy-related things. So council tax rates, for instance, increased at a faster rate in Scotland for this financial year relative to the UK as a whole. But there are also some structural things related to consumption categories that are disproportionately consumed here relative to the UK as a whole. In the first example there is energy. So energy prices have increased massively globally across the UK and of course here in Scotland. But one national specific factor is that there are fewer households here in relative terms that are on the usual energy grid network, which means that there's more consumer exposure to paying for alternative forms of fuel, notably heating oil. And relative to the regular grid, these alternative forms of fuel are more exposed to volatility in global energy markets, which have, of course, been rocked by the escalation of conflict in the Middle East and the subsequent escalation in oil prices. On a similar note, motor fuels are also exposed to global commodity price volatility, and these are also disproportionately consumed in Scotland, where a larger share of commutes are taken by car relative to the UK average. And so consumers here are seeing more outgoings from energy and motor fuels. All in all then, it paints a picture of a relatively weak consumer landscape for Scotland at the moment. It should be noted that there is weakness across the whole of the UK, but there are some specific factors that we can drill down on. Zooming out from the consumer picture, there are, of course, implications of a weak Scottish consumer for the economy as a whole. having slower rates of discretionary income growth tends to result in a pullback on spending on luxury items, so things like dining out, holidays, etc., which has already been alluded to in the previously presented data. So that could impact sectors such as retail, hospitality, transport, etc. In terms of Scotland's wider economic composition, there are also some other factors that present headwinds. In terms of the industry composition, there are more energy-intensive industries in Scotland relative to the UK economy as a whole, and as a result, they are similarly exposed to the global headwinds that I've mentioned in the form of energy price volatility, which subsequently impacts input costs, margins, and hence the ability to produce productive output. So here we're talking about the likes of agriculture, manufacturing, and other energy-intensive businesses that contribute a lot to Scottish output and employment. All in all, then, it's a relatively poor combination of factors for the economy. We still expect there to be growth this year. Our latest forecast for Scottish GVA is for around a 1% uptick relative to last year. That is below the long-term trend, however. It's also below the forecast for the UK average. So while it's not quite a perfect storm of negative factors, there are certainly some things that we can drill into to explain the relatively pessimistic consumer attitudes that have been reported in Scott's data. So with that, I will hand over to Lesley Ann for her section of the presentation.
Sorry guys, mouse isn't working. Right, there we go, that's better. Hi everyone, my name's Lesley Ann Gray, so I'm the Strategic Insight Director for Worldpanel in Scotland. We used to be called Kantar, so you might know us from Kantar data. So how do we get our data? Well, the first thing to think about is we have a panel of 30,000 households in GB, and we have a subset of that panel in Scotland. We're about to go to 55,000. But if you can imagine everything you buy in the grocery channel, all those shopping trolleys, all those baskets, those households share them with us. And then we've been going since 1976, so we can look at that cumulative basket and see how it's changed and how people have reacted to the pressures that they're feeling that both Scott and Sam have talked about today. So 3 things I want to talk to you about: the big picture, retailers and consumer choices, and also how those rising costs have actually impacted live behaviours in terms of how shoppers are shopping. Keep pressing the wrong button. See when it's someone else's mouse? Right, so this is quite a complicated chart, but the reason for showing it is that if you look at the pale blue line, that's how we monitor food inflation. And if you look at the dark blue line, that is the oil prices. And what I want to show you is those gaps. So in terms of food inflation, there tends to be a lag between big world events impacting oil and how we all shop as a nation. So whilst our inflation at the moment is relatively low, it's under 3%, we're still expecting that to rise. And to be fair, we're quite surprised that it hasn't risen quite as fast as we were expecting. I can't get that to change, Scott. There we go. So when we monitor all the different food categories, what we've found is that out of the 134 macro categories, so that is things like dairy, milk, bread, etc., 116 of them are actually inflating. So that means every time you go to buy them, they're actually costing you more than they would have done last year. And that's the pressure that people are feeling on their baskets. So what do we do when we've got that pressure? We've got choices. We can leave the category, and by that I mean we can leave the food category. So you maybe buy olives every week. You maybe now only buy them once a fortnight. You may buy steak once a week, and you've reduced. So you've left that category and you're not buying as much. Now that has implications because for the factories and the producers and the farmers that are producing that, if we are buying less, that is an impact on their factories and the amount of people that they employ. We definitely buy less stuff, so we've reduced our repertoire. For some, we've just come away from it altogether. We're just not buying the same products that we used to buy, and Scott talked about that in terms of less fresh produce. We can also buy less of the same, so we can reduce our pack sizes. Maybe before we would always buy a large pack of something, now we've reduced the size. We can shop in cheaper stores. We can move from some of the supermarkets into some of the low-cost discounters and lower-cost retailers. And we can buy cheaper stuff. So we can buy more on promotion, we can buy more private label because the average price is cheaper, or we can buy cheaper variants of what we currently produce in our basket. And at Worldpanel, we are seeing evidence of all of that. So this is a horrible chart, it's a waterfall chart, but I want you to focus on the two end bars. So that one on the left is the spend last year for a 12-week period. So that's up at £36 billion. On the right, we've got 37. The points in green, the bars in green are what's driving that cost. And I've highlighted the inflation exposure. That is what's driven the cost. So yeah, product mix, repeat volume, a slightly higher population will drive the overall cost of groceries in the UK. But when you look at what is coming down and what is suppressing that cost, the biggest thing is category repertoire, and that's the number of categories that shoppers are buying and putting in their baskets, and that is what's bringing down the overall cost. So it's like a seesaw. So you've got certain things that increase the cost, you've got certain behaviours that reduce the cost, but the two that we're seeing the most is actual food inflation coming through, balanced by people buying less. So we've got our own pressure groups. So out of that household panel, people tell us whether they're struggling, whether they're managing, or whether they're comfortable. So those that were struggling have hovered around about the 22%. And what we can see is different shopping behaviours depending on how people are feeling. And this isn't to do with socio-economic groups or salaries, etc. This is actually how they're feeling themselves. So those that are struggling, we see trends such as health becomes less important to them. They're moving spend in home, and what by that we mean they're spending less out of home in hospitality, and they're moving those behaviours in home. They also tend to like family packs and convenience, and they have a sweet tooth as well. They tend to over-index on some of the sweeter products. So let's look at the consumer choices in the retail environment. This goes back to 2015, and it basically shows the different channels, the different options people have open to them in order to buy groceries. So the grey bar, 2005, 63 pence in every pound was spent in a supermarket, and 11 pence in every pound was spent in a discounter. By a discounter we mean an Aldi, a Lidl, a Home Bargains, etc. If you go forward to 2025, what you can see is that discounters have really increased their share of the market. They've got a reduced product mix, but they offer on average a lower average price for every product, and that's eaten into the share of the big supermarkets, which is why you see all the price match to Aldi, price match to Lidl, etc. in the marketplace. Now this focuses purely on the online channel, so if you get your groceries delivered, if you order via Amazon, this represents that share. And you can see the blue peak was during COVID when a lot of people moved to this channel, so they didn't have to mix with anyone else. But that has sustained, and one of the main reasons for online sustaining and continuing to grow is it offers the perfect opportunity to control spend. Because you put everything in your online basket, you get to the checkout, you look at what you've spent, you think, I'm not spending that. So you start taking things out. I'm sure that's a behaviour that we're all quite familiar with. You start taking things out your virtual basket. These figures are purely for Scotland. So grocery in Scotland is worth 15 billion a year. It grew at 3.3%. But that product purchasing, the volume of products that people bought, is pretty flat. And that's why I said at the beginning about the implications that has on manufacturers, producers and farmers, because essentially we're paying more. Our average price per product has went up by 3%, which is the food inflation you're seeing coming through, but we're not actually purchasing any more volume, and that has its own implications for the economy. Underneath, I've looked at whiskey, bread and milk. So that yellow bar on the right means that's an increase in average price. So for those categories, maybe 2 out of 3 are essential, 3 out of 3 for some of you maybe are essential, but they've all seen an increase in average price. And if we monitor so many products and so many categories, but so many charts that I'm looking at the moment, there's very few categories that haven't seen an increase in average price. What you're seeing to the left of that bar is volume per trip declining, frequency, the number of times you buy it, declining, and penetration declining. So these are all real live behaviours that we're actually witnessing at home. I'm just going to have a quick look at how our impact on the behaviours at home. So if I go back to 2022-23, when it was the previous cost of living crisis, these were all the behaviours that we did. We simplified our meals, we made different meal choices, we cooked slightly differently. This was the invention of the air fryer, which reduced all the energy that we needed to cook. Eating and drinking away from home, we had fewer of those moments. Those 3 that I've marked in red are the behaviours that we are not seeing this time. So everything else, we're seeing implications of that and evidence of that in the market, but we're not seeing people deprioritise health. We're not seeing the cheaper cooking methods or the lower effort cooking coming through. This is Consumer Confidence Index mapped with the percentage of servings chosen for health. So you can see where that consumer confidence is just flatlined, but the number of products that we're actually choosing for health has continued to increase. So health appears to be becoming more ingrained in our everyday choices, which is a good thing. We've also seen this impact the market. So GLP-1, you can't get away from it. We monitor it in terms of those households that work with us and share their baskets of goods. So they tell us how many people within the household are on GLP-1, and it's risen from 4.1 to 6.3%. That has implications for what people who are using GLP-1 are putting into their shopping baskets. If I take one category, which is chocolate confectionery, we're seeing an 18 percentage points decline in spend and a 17 percentage decline in volume. The other category that we're seeing huge differences in with this is actually alcohol as well. So how are we cooking? We're spending less time cooking. On average, it's 31 minutes for our evening meals. Families are spending less time cooking and they're looking for more convenience. Takeaways are actually becoming quite ingrained within that demographic group, and we're putting fewer ingredients on our plate. So that has dropped consistently in the last 5 years. If we look at the percentage of evening meals that are cooked from scratch, you can see it's families with older dependents is where we're seeing that increase. So empty nesters, fairly low. A lot of people are surprised at that in terms of 16%. Pre-families round about 20%. So why are people cooking from scratch? We all know that it's cheaper. So on average, it's more than 60 pence cheaper per person than using a sauce or a kit. And it can be 20% healthier. Now, you might recognise this in your own behaviours. I've got a 19-year-old and a 21-year-old, and we do fakeaways all the time. So my whole fridge is just full of Nando's peri-peri sauces and mayonnaises, and that's because they are creating that Nando's experience at home. Because people are generally going out less, but they still want the experience at home. And the way we're cooking at home in terms of meal kits. So if anybody does the dine-in, Marks and Spencer's, the £15, where you're getting that gastropub experience at the weekend, rather than going out, we're creating more of these occasions in home, and that's actually opened up a market for a lot of manufacturers to supply. So to summarise, financial pressure, it definitely remains a reality. We are expecting inflation to increase. We're quite surprised that it hasn't increased already. And those higher costs will consistently impact shopper behaviour in terms of what we put in our baskets. The positive is health certainly remains a priority, and we're seeing that across lots of different social groups, and also even those that are facing pressures. GLP-1 is definitely having an impact on what we put in our baskets. Meals are becoming less complex, prep times are falling, younger consumers are actually moving towards less cooking, and we're trying to recreate those out-of-home experiences back home as part of that measure to reduce our budgets. Thank you so much.
Take seats, please, while I'm clicking through this. There we go. Sorry, I'm on it, Alan. Right, now we come to questions from the audience. I've got one question before I start. There was a slight difference I heard. So Scott, you were saying SIMD 1 and 2 weren't prioritising health. Are you seeing that in yours? Because you're saying, where it said...
Yeah, so our struggling shoppers are those that are telling us, but they're not necessarily linked to SIMD. So
Okay.
people even in higher incomes could still be saying that they're struggling. So it's probably to do with the different data sets.
Okay. Okay.
Is that better? Yeah. Sorry, do you want me to repeat that?
Yes, repeat that just for the...
Yeah, so it's probably to do with the different data sets. So even though those that are the struggling, the comfortable, and those that are managing is related to how they feel rather than to income levels, whereas I think the SIMD is related to postcode and deprivation levels. So it's a slightly different view. So even those in high incomes can still feel as though they're struggling.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, I'm going to come to the audience for questions. If you want to put your hands up.
It's a twofold question. The first part is to Scott. When you referred to reduction in meat purchase, were you referring to red meat or did it include chicken? And what do the panel view as the future health implications of the, I would submit, over-adoption of ready-made meal purchase in terms of UPF and future health implications for the NHS? Because they're not healthy and they're full of additives, some of which are totally inappropriate.
Just explain what UPF is for anyone that doesn't know.
UPF, for people who don't know, is ultra-processed foods.
Thank you. Panel?
So meat, it just says meat, so it would cover all meats. So, yeah. And then I think on the kind of wider question, I'm not an expert on like the actual health outcomes in and of themselves, but I think it probably follows that if we're thinking people are picking food items that we don't feel are as healthy, or there is some kind of implication for health in the long run, or higher salt, higher sugar, higher whatever, that I think you would think eventually that will follow through into the NHS, and it will have an impact. And I think it's quite new, it's a new-ish thing, so we don't have kind of history to go back on and go, well, people started adopting that then, and look what happened then. If you adapt, it's new, and I think it's something that probably needs to be kind of monitored as it kind of develops.
Yeah, in terms of the proteins, so chicken, we're seeing chicken volume increase because price per kilo for chicken versus beef and versus fish is much cheaper. So certainly chicken hasn't seen the same volume drops that perhaps beef has. Pork's actually come through as well. So pork's actually doing quite well at the moment, and again it's related to average price per kilo. In terms of the UPFs, it's one of the kind of 4 trends, health trends, that we are seeing coming through. So in terms of our own surveys from our panellists, UPF is starting to appear in those surveys as an area of concern. I think the implications for that are more difficult because the UPF scale is quite confusing. So it's our plan to actually look at the baskets and actually grade them per NOVA scale, which is the UPFs use. But it's quite a difficult UPF, and the scale that's used to do it is quite difficult for normal shoppers to get their health around. So there's implications there as well.
Thanks. Question for Lesley Ann. How long is Aldi and even Lidl going to remain as a discounter? Because in terms of quality, I would choose to shop at Aldi over some of the other main supermarkets, probably the one.
Yeah, it's almost like a hygiene factor, us calling them discounters. The reason that we class them as a discounter is because the range of SKUs, so the range of products that they shop, so they still have a far smaller range of products than say an Asda or a Tesco do. So they're in their 40,000s, and Aldi and Lidl are normally around sort of 45,000 different products, and for that reason we split them out. But for all intents purposes, yeah, you would call them a grocer, just like the others. But for us, because of the kind of terminology that we use, and is related to their product choice.
This is perhaps a question for Scott, I think, but just talking about the reduction in economic activity, the higher unemployment, pared back spending. I mean, are these sorts of cycles that you see being repeated over time, or that sounds like potentially a bit of a terminal decline because less tax take and all the rest of it? How do we spend on infrastructure? How do we try to invest to get ourselves into the start of the next economic cycle or market cycle? These things that you see, or it sounds like it's quite negative.
Has been the economic outlook over the course of the series has been sort of very negative, as you've seen in the chart, and I could deliberately show that one where it's like right at the sort of bottom. It is responsive to events though, so like when we see those real declines, so the kind of points where you see the real declines in confidence would be kind of during COVID and before we come out, the cost of living crisis almost like immediately subsequent to COVID, and then again in May when we saw that hit. That would have been around the time where I think we were all expecting a big follow through from sort of the conflict in the Middle East and then what that was going to do for oil prices. I think one of the things about this is that people remember what happened in the last couple of like kind of crashes and things. So like I always use this example, and it's a bit of a ridiculous one really, but it's like the price of cooking oil and butter. Everyone remembers in 2023 when the Ukraine war started, everyone's going, "What? How has that gone up so much?" And I think the people, when they hear these things now, are a bit more sensitive to then say, I think things are going to be worse. But that transfer from kind of worse to same to better, it feels like we kind of get a wee bit into same and then we don't quite get into better, and I'm not really sure what unlocks that basically.
To add to that, there are of course cyclical components of economic activity that fluctuate from positive to negative. I think the concern with current circumstances, though, is that the negative side that we're on now could interact with more longer-term structural developments that make it harder to kind of recoup that positive. So examples there would include the fact that we have an aging population, the fact that youth unemployment is rising, the fact that hiring for entry-level positions seems to be the weakest in modern times. So all these factors could interact with the kind of short-term cyclical shock to produce more embedded structural economic weakness.
Thanks, everyone. Really fascinating presentations. Question perhaps first for Scott, and then any other thoughts would be great. I think, Scott, you said in your work satisfaction, it was a combined 66% were somewhat satisfied or very satisfied with their job security. I'm just wondering how that squares with this hurtling up the curve of enterprise AI adoption, and are you planning to ask, as well as the satisfaction with security, whether people are thinking about how replaceable they are, and perhaps more widely, are we seeing a bit of a boiling frog in these stats?
I think so. It didn't change much between the last time that we asked it, so we've not seen a massive shift in terms of people that kind of coming down or anything on that job security point. I think the point on looking at AI and that replaceability is probably something worth digging into, and probably something worth asking. We know from kind of business surveys that are done that actually there's quite big AI adoption happening across the piece, and there's sort of qualitative evidence and anecdotal evidence sort of out there that people talk about. Am I just training these models to replace myself? We started to adopt them and use them, and there is some hesitancy out there. So yeah, probably would be interesting to do a bit of work around sort of some quantitative measures on that and seeing how that looks in the workforce.
Do you break the jobs confidence data down by industry?
No.
Okay, could be interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been really interesting. I kind of coming at it from I'm a recruiter within agriculture, and obviously working across that has been interesting, predominantly when the word immigration came up, actually. And it was just to get your thoughts on that and how that's impacting. I mean, it's obviously, I'm assuming immigration is a concern, but I don't know in what way, because obviously in Scotland it could be viewed upon both ways. It's both negative, but we kind of need it as well for a lot of the, particularly agriculture. So just to get your thoughts on that in terms of how those concerns are impacting spend and what you see is going to happen in the future, obviously using your crystal ball.
I think the immigration statistic, I think, because we kind of do other work where we look at kind of attitudes towards immigration and sort of like asking people whether they want to see more or less, and we've actually seen at the same time as immigration's increased as an issue in this series, we've also seen a hardening of that attitude in other series that are done. So therefore, when you kind of look at the timing of it all and the kind of manner in which immigration has been spoken about in public discourse over the period that we've seen that increase, I think it follows that it's likely that negative sentiment that does see that increase as an issue. Now that doesn't take away from the kind of debate that then happens in, kind of like the Scottish Government's position, which is actually we need migration in order to, kind of even maintain the sort of level of public services that we have and maintain the tax that we have now. So there's a conflict there. I think that's kind of what you're getting at, is that we're having this sort of discussion at the same time we're seeing this hardening attitude. Sam, kind of you mentioned there, it was mentioned in the kind of previous question, like that there is a discussion to be had on that, but the discussion I think that we have now is very much primarily, what we see in the news, it's very much primarily stop the boats, etc., etc. That is the discussion, and that seems to be what is driving that sort of sentiment. And we can see it in, the kind of demographics and the other concerns that the people shared as well when they look at the top 3 issues. And I'd be happy to I'm going to dig a bit more into that and post some stuff online about it, because it kind of keeps coming up. So I'm going to post some stuff around on that as well, a bit of a deeper dive.
Thanks very much. It's been really interesting, and particularly thinking about, I suppose, these issues about the relationship between people's incomes and the kind of things that you try and purchase in a kind of like standard kind of basket of goods and services. I wonder to what extent as well we're seeing in Scotland issues around people's kind of financial security relating to the point that you sort of picked up, Scott, about the quality of public services, and that a third of the people in the survey identified a lack of spending on public services as being one of the problems. Is there any sort of way of getting a handle on how inadequate public services do put sort of pressure on household finances? I mean, the University of Loughborough, with their minimum income standard, they think that adults need an extra £200 a year just to deal with the costs that they incur whilst they're waiting on NHS waiting lists, and that's just one example. And is there any evidence in the survey that it's the people who identify that sort of lack of spending on public services who then are also experiencing the sort of like negative kind of like mental health issues, or are they disconnected?
Honestly, I don't have the immediate answer to that. However, that is something that, with the kind of cross breaks in the data we have, that we are actually able to look into. So I cannot give you like an answer without just making something up right now. But I would imagine we're going to see a relationship between that kind of, saying that, it kind of feels worse and the issues. But I'll look into it and get back to you, David.
Thank you. I've got two questions. One very specific, which I'll start with for Sam. And the second more general, pretty much for everyone, which has sort of been touched on a couple of times. First for Sam is on the economic comparators with the rest of the UK. Do you have the comparison which would exclude London? Because obviously I would imagine that our figures in Scotland are probably better aligned to what's happening in Manchester and Liverpool and Bradford and other places rather than the whole of the UK. So it'd be interesting to hear what those are. The second question comes back to a kind of point that the lady also touched on, is that it seems to me there's some contradictions in the statistics where, how can I say, people don't understand connections. So if the primary basket is convenience, whether that's delivered to home, ready meals, whatever, how does that relate to the increased interest in health? Why don't people make the connection that they could save money and be healthier by eating raw food? And the second big contradiction I saw was in the statistics at the beginning, where the cost of living is the priority, but the economy only features, and people don't make the connection between what's happening in the economy with the cost of living. And it seems to me the two things are related, but maybe that's because I've studied economics.
So on the first question, I think I could have delivered a similar presentation in Cardiff or Belfast. So suggests that, you know, there are structural similarities between those sort of economies and Scotland, and therefore it's certainly not Scotland-specific set of issues. So if you were to take out London and the southeast, the picture probably would align closer to what I've delivered specifically here. So yeah, it's to say that it's not a Scotland-specific set of problems.
Yeah, so we're quite similar in that we can extract Scotland and compare Scotland to England, or Scotland to a region in England. And this is just a kind of on the side note, but my colleagues down south, they're reporting record sales of ice cream. They reported record sales of beer during the World Cup. And needless to say, when I was looking at the Scotland statistics for ice cream and beer during the World Cup, they were slightly less. So yeah, so we do see regional differences in the behaviour. The slide that I showed that said that 28% of servings were being chosen for health was claimed behaviour. When we look at the baskets, we're seeing something else. So our data comes from what's actually in the baskets, because these products are scanned and are in our virtual shelves, if you like. But when people are saying they're choosing for health, sometimes that doesn't always translate into what they put in their baskets. Convenience is an interesting one. So we are constantly seeing a need for convenience through lots of different lifestyle stages. So people are just looking for quick and easy. And with that, as I say, our first lady who said that tends to lead to more ultra-processed foods, because that's a huge part of convenience. So it's more subtle, I think, and more complex than just statements. I think people do want to become healthy, but their behaviours aren't always replicating what their desire to be healthy is. But there's certainly, it's changing. It's changing. I've been in this position for 8 years now, and that health has definitely changed and has become more of a focus, even if we look back from where we were 8 years ago as well. So people generally know they need to be healthy, want to be healthy. They don't always make the food choices that they need to do that.
Question mostly for yourself, Sam, and it kind of comes back to what you were saying around about graduate prospects. So I think a study came out a couple of days ago. I think it was with Indeed, but I'm not quite sure. And they found there'd been a roughly 50% reduction in job vacancies compared to this time last year, which were explicitly for sort of graduate positions. And semi-anecdotally, I know that a lot of people are saying, this has been around about the drive internally within a number of organisations to shift the focus towards investment in artificial intelligence. However, this sort of investment has been going on for quite a while now. I work at ICAS within research, and we found that while some people have found incremental benefits to their roles, it's not quite translating into the huge economic boom that I suppose people were maybe expecting 18 months ago, 12 months ago, 6 months ago. And I was wondering, are you seeing AI come up in discussions around about the economy and in terms of people's own financial well-being often? And if so, is it being sort of shown in optimistic terms or more pessimistic terms?
Sure. So to directly address the latter part of the question, I don't think AI is at the forefront of the consumer economic space. I think the kind of trickle down of productivity gains that improve their employers' prospects and then improve their standing as a consumer, I don't think we're anywhere near that section of the curve for it to be making a noticeable impact. In terms of the wider context of the question around AI adoption coinciding with declining graduate vacancies, I think it's also important to look at some other factors as well. So the cost of employing a graduate now is much higher than it has been in recent years because of increases in minimum wages, increases in national insurance contributions, etc. So I think the relative difference between investing in tech improvements versus onboarding graduates, there's probably never been a wider divergence there.
Could I ask Lesley a question about the supply side as opposed to the demand side of your work? I mean, we notice, not least with GLP-1 and so on, that manufacturers are making smaller portion sizes and keeping the same price point. Obviously, that adds to inflation. I just wonder how you tackle the question of the changing product composition in your work. It strikes me as a particular challenge.
Data that we collect, we also collect the back of pack data, the nutritional information. So you're exactly right. What we can see is that GLP-1 has given opportunities to lots of manufacturers and lots of retailers to come up with nutrient-dense ranges. And these nutrient-dense ranges tend to be a smaller pack weight and also have more nutrients in them. And we know that through the data that we're collecting. From an industry perspective, they see it as an opportunity. Some of the charts that I showed that volume being static or even in decline. So for them, they're seeing that as an opportunity to try and keep their plants busy, keep their factories busy by adapting to some of these new needs. In terms of the price per gram probably being slightly higher, I think that's why they will see that as an opportunity. Does that answer your question?
Well, but you have a basket of goods. You may not be able to track the same basket of goods over time if the...
No, so we the way our data's... Yeah, but the way our data's collected, we can see the changes coming through, so we can see all the different products and we can see the weights and the nutritional information behind all those products. So we can look at an average basket and see whether or not protein has increased. So we worked a lot with the soft drinks industry when they were removing sugar, for instance, and we could see the hundreds of tons of sugar being taken out when they all reformulated to the diet versions several years ago because of the sugar tax levy. So we can monitor that through our baskets, and we do see those changes coming through. But this year and towards the end of last year, most of the retailers actually produced nutrient-dense, smaller portions, ranges that you would see on shelf to kind of meet that demand.
I'm left not so much with a question as a sort of fundamental observation. One is that there is inadequacy in the curriculum about food purchase, preparation, storage and usage. And the other is, at what point will society actually ensure that primary producers like farmers are properly paid? Because at the moment, I don't think they are.
Oh, I don't know how we... Sam, do you want to comment on that?
My clients are producers and farmers, and I work with a lot of the industry boards that do that, so I would probably agree that it's always been a challenge for them. But I can't comment on the school curriculum because it falls out with my data set. But I agree with you. I think as a nation, sometimes we don't pay enough to our producers. Also for food security as well, as food security is an area that we don't tend to talk about as well within the industry.
I was struck by the observation that, well, not quite struck, but people are cooking less or spending less time cooking. They're going out less, and at the same time, you have mental health issues and things like that. And I wondered if there was a correlation between like people having more free time and these mental health concerns, and if we had any insights into what people are doing with all this extra time.
We do have a health questionnaire, but we don't at the moment link it to the purchase data, so I can't comment on mental health and a decline in cooking.
I can't really remember what the study is, but a study came out in the last couple of weeks showing that younger people are spending more time on their own as well. So there's a couple of things going on to do in terms of young people's mental health. I'll have a look and remember it, but a couple of the factors were just spending more time alone, not socialising because of finances, and also spending more time at home alone because of changes in working patterns, like working from home as well, for example. So when we were comparing cohorts, they were finding that younger people were spending a lot more time alone compared to people kind of that were a bit older at the same age they were. And it was looking at some of the impacts of that, so I'll dig that out and send it to you. It doesn't directly correlate with the cooking, but it certainly talks about how people are spending their time.
Just to go back on the point on school curriculums and diets, I think there are certainly kind of measurable ways of looking at how changing incentives can change behaviour. So if adjusting the school curriculum to make people make more informed choices there is a way to incentivise that, I think that would be a long-term positive.
Now it falls to me to draw this to a close. I think we could go on a lot longer. I have so many more questions, and I think about what Sam said there in terms of changing behaviour. And now I know this doesn't affect everyone, but I was at there's a new outdoor sauna in Edinburgh, and I was there the other day, and the group of people before me were a bunch of women, and they said we usually meet up for lunch and then have a boozy afternoon lunch, and she said we're not doing that anymore, we're doing something healthy, and they'd spent the afternoon at the sauna. And I just think that is a tiny micro story of how people are changing, whether it's meeting up for park runs or beginning to think about more healthy choices. But like the data shows us, it's not everyone that's reaching. So I think we're going to see more differences as the surveys continue. Anyway, that's my initial reflection, but there are so many. So I've put a QR code on the screen for those of you joining us, particularly the first time. We'd love to hear your feedback. We work hard to bring together different reflectors each time. So every 3 months or every quarter, depending on how you like to talk about your year, we gather a panel to reflect on the data and bring you different insights from different data sets, and that's what we've done today. We hope you've enjoyed it. Please do remember, as a charity, the David Hume Institute can only continue to bring you free events like this as a result of donations. So if you're able, please consider donating. And I'd like to thank all our speakers as well as the audience for the diverse questions. And now all that's left, and to thank Samuel and the University of Edinburgh Business School and Asda for making this possible. And now handing over to Grace.
Hi, thank you everyone. I won't take up too much more of your time. It's mostly just to say thank you, first of all, to our brilliant panellists. It's been a really interesting discussion. And of course, thank you to Susan for approaching me about coming together for this event, because I think it's really worthwhile sort of bringing together that sort of collaboration. And that's why events like these are so important and why we're so delighted to support today. We think bringing together industry representatives, talking about the kind of key issues. And at Asda, we know the issues that are obviously facing our customers, the economic and social concerns that they have, which is why we do have our income tracker. But thank you very much for joining us, and saving us a lot of food for thought. But please do join us for some drinks afterwards. We look forward to talking more about everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and goodbye to everyone online. Thank you for joining us online too, and we'll see you all again soon.